Girls, it's that time for Freedom Crossing, so grab your book to read along. As always, we'll start with reviewing the questions from chapter 11. Um, the first question that you had to do for chapter 11 was asked, how has Laura changed? She says in that chapter, um, no matter what the law said, it couldn't be right to turn a boy like Martin over to such a man. And she was talking about Walt. And it compared because in the beginning of the book, she was saying things like, I don't care if Martin goes or stays, and it's the law, and do you know better than the law? And she completely thought that slaves should be returned, that they were property, that that was the right thing to do, and it was right to abide by the law. Now, all of a sudden, that she knows Martin, one of you used the word, maybe two of you used the word empathy when you answered that question. It seems she has more empathy for Martin and maybe for other slaves as well because she's starting to see the truths that she didn't know. The next question you had to answer is, what does trespassing mean? The majority of you have that right. It's when you're on somebody else's property. But one point that you might have missed is it's when you're on somebody else's property without their permission, would be trespassing. I asked you to describe with details the appearance of Tryon's folly. And that was a long answer question. When you answer the questions, so you can do more than one line for most of them. You can do multiple sentences for questions like that, especially if you see a question that's worth like 15 points. It means I'm looking for more details. I'm looking for a little more depth. Okay, when you talk about the details to describe Tryon's folly, there's things like it was large and impressive, covered with gray stucco. It was long, rectangular building, 2 stories high. Chimneys rose above the peaked roof, one near the house and one near the south end. You have things like, in spite of the fact that the walls of the house were solid and undamaged, the place looked of a ruin because of the many windows that were broken. You have details like they found themselves in a large room. There were birds in it. Feathers and droppings littered the floor. There were cobwebs that laced the corners. There were mice and there were bats. Okay. You could have talked about the fireplace, a large fireplace. Of course, the 4 cellars ascending one down the other down the bank. There were so many details to describe this house, and I was looking for more. So keep in mind when you see those questions, especially the ones that are worth like 15 points, it means I'm looking for a little more than a basic one sentence kind of answer. Um, and I asked you why was it the title of the chapter, The House with 4 Cellars? It was pretty self-explanatory because it was all about Tryon's Folly, which is a house that has 4 descending cellars. One leads down to the next until they get to the riverbank. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. We're ready for chapter 12, Freedom Crossing, Margaret Gough Clark. Again, I don't own the rights to this book. I am just reading to my students. Here we go. And again, you should have your book and reading along with me. Chapter 12, where I should say where we left off for chapter 11, Laura says this has to be the place where Joel intended to take Martin tonight. Now we're in chapter 12, which starts on page 100. The title is A Fugitive is Captured. And remember, a fugitive is somebody who is escaping or trying to escape from the law. So does that mean Martin's going to be captured? Let's find out. Bert ventured a few feet down the path, but then raced back to Laura and pulled her into the cellar. There's someone out in the boat, he cautioned. They can't see us with all those bushes, Laura pointed out. I suppose you're right, Bert conceded. But I'll be in trouble with Pa and Joel if the slave catchers find out about this place because of me. Pa never told me where he took the runaways. Guess he didn't think I could keep still about it. I think Pa wanted to keep you safe. It's dangerous business, you know. Anyway, she consoled him, Joel must have trusted you, or he wouldn't have sent that note. Bert's face brightened, but he said only, he was desperate. Laura crossed the narrow cellar, crouched beside the pool, and scooped up a handful of water. Top of page 101. It was clear and cold. She tasted it and found it good. A slave could stay here a long time, she remarked. Do you suppose Amos Tryon built these cellars on purpose for hiding fugitives? Bert shook the ladder, testing its strength. Course not. Probably he planned to use the cellar for a spring house. Butter and milk would keep well in that cold water. Laura began to see the possibilities of the riverbank cellars. One could be a laundry room. They could pipe the water up from the spring. and another could be a wine cellar. She gazed around the small room where they stood. I guess if these cellars had been planned for the slaves, there'd be some secret hiding places down here. I don't see any place where a slave could get out of sight if the slave catchers came around. Bert agreed. It was too easy for us to find our way through the cellars, he sighed. I guess no place is perfect. At least this is hidden from the road, and it's on the river. Laura stepped outside again and gazed up at the steep banks on either side of the house. The cellars certainly are the best way to reach the river. A person could climb down the bank, but it would be dangerous. Bert started up the ladder. Let's go home. Martin will be worried. When they emerged from the house, the sun was still bright, though it was low in the sky. Bert paused only to blow out the lantern before they took the path through the woods. Page 102. I wish you didn't have to come back here tonight, Laura worried. I know I'd hate to come through here in the dark. Maybe Joel will come and I won't have to take Martin. You'd be disappointed if you couldn't go, she challenged him. Maybe I would at that. I think you and Joel and Paula aren't in this Underground Railroad just because of the slaves. It's an adventure. Bert glanced back over his shoulder. You wouldn't understand. Pa says a man's conscience is stronger than the law. And he says laws can be bad, like the fugitive slave law. Do you know that law says a slave catcher can swear any black he finds is a fugitive he's looking for, and the black hasn't any right to speak for himself? He pushed on down the lane, muttering, "That old Henry Clay, he's to blame for getting the law passed." So question number 1, what does Bert mean when he says, which he just kind of reiterates what his pa says, a man's conscience is stronger than the law. A man's conscience is stronger than the law. And he says laws can be bad. What do you think that means? Back to the book. Laura thought of pointing out that Henry Clay wasn't the only person to blame, but rather than get into an argument, she changed the subject. I suppose Martin couldn't find this place alone? Of course he couldn't, in the dark, and it wouldn't be safe for him to be wandering around. The minute anyone saw him, they'd know who he was. Top of page 103. Sally whinnied her pleasure at seeing Laura and Bert again. Laura ran ahead to see if anyone was on the road while Bert backed the carriage down the narrow lane. The leaves rustled under her feet, making, she felt, too much noise. And what would anyone think, seeing her burst forth from the woods with her hair flying and her bonnet hanging down her back? Slowing her pace, she slipped into the denser shadow of a pine tree. Here she stood motionless, listening for the sound of hoofs or wagon wheels on the river road. All she heard was the creak and rustle of their own carriage on the lane, and Sally's snort of protest at being forced back so far. Encouraged, she peered around the tree and finally emerged boldly onto the edge of the road. No one was in sight. She ran back to Bert. Hurry! The road's clear! Remembering how he had removed their tracks on the way to Tryon's Folly, she snatched up a branch, and as soon as the carriage was again on the road, she whisked out the tracks to the entrance of the lane. Jump in, Bert urged. No telling when someone will come along. They had been under way only a minute or two and were approaching Judge Stowe's house when a horse and rider pounded toward them. That was close, murmured Bert. Page 104. The rider slowed his horse and shouted to them. They caught a slave in Lewiston. I'm rounding up help to set him free. Good, shouted Bert. When the rider had gone on, Laura asked fearfully, Do you think it's Martin? Bert slapped on the reins. Giddy up, he shouted. How do I know? He should have been safe enough, provided he stayed where we left him. We've been gone a long time. Maybe he decided we deserted him. Or maybe the slave catchers broke into the house and found him. Bert agreed with maddening calm. It may be, was all he said. Laura stared anxiously ahead. Perhaps at this very moment Walt was taking Martin back to the master who had beaten him. Can't that horse go any faster? Of course she can. She's the fastest horse for miles around. But if we go racing down the road, someone's going to wonder why we're in such a hurry and maybe follow us home. Oh, all right. Laura sat back on the seat and yanked her bonnet into place on her head. Are you going to try to set the runaway free, whoever he is? She was so sure Bert would say yes, she wondered why she even asked. But to her amazement, he shook his head. Pa says we shouldn't draw notice to ourselves. We can do more good working in secret. Top of page 105. On Center Street, the press of people became thick in spite of the wideness of the road. Bert jumped down from the carriage and, flinging the reins to Laura, called out, "Wait here!" From her vantage point on the carriage seat, Laura could see her brother pushing his way through the crowd that poured up the street to the east. Laura called out to a woman passerby, "Where's everyone going?" "To the Presbyterian church. They cornered a runaway slave there." The church was on Cayuga, not far from Joel's house. Laura pulled Sally to the side of the road in front of Mr. Josiah Tryon's tailor shop. Through the window she could see Mr. Tryon was working as if nothing were going on outside. The dark-bearded man who had been with him before was still there, standing near the window. If Mr. Tryon was a leader in the Underground Railroad, would he sit inside there with his back to the window? Yes, maybe he would. Just as Bert said, he wouldn't want to be noticed as a sympathizer. Near the tailor shop, a narrow road called Niagara Street led south toward Cayuga. It was a small street, little more than an alleyway. The crowd was ignoring this shortcut. Only a few people broke away from the rest and ran down it. Top of page 106. Laura hesitated only a moment. Bert had said to wait, but she had just as much as right as he to find out if the captured fugitive was Martin. She stepped down from the carriage and tied Sally to a hitching post. Then, with her skirt lifted above her ankles, she fled down Niagara Street. She ran until she was out of breath. Then she walked as rapidly as she could past Plain Street and on toward Cayuga. When she slowed down to catch her breath, she caught snatches of conversation from the others who hurried toward the church. "We ought to lynch them! Show those Southerners we know how to do it, too!" Laura looked in amazement at the speaker, a gentle-faced man with white hair hanging over his ears in a fringe. "Those slave catchers have no business coming up north," the white-haired man declared. "Ought to give them the taste of their own medicine." Hearing this, Laura realized he was in favor of lynching the slave catchers, not the captured slave. She set her lips firmly together. What should a person think these days? One thing she was sure of. Lynching was wrong, no matter who the victim was. And that's the end of chapter 12. So the Google form will have the question I asked here and a couple of more, and I will see you all soon. Bye.